Between the rivers. The remains of ancient Mesopotamia lie between the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. For thousands of years, people living nomadic lifestyles roamed the region in search of food. By 6000 BC, agriculture, or the raising of crops and livestock for food, had developed. Over time, small farming settlements grew into the world's first cities. The birth of civilization. Historians refer to ancient Mesopotamia as the birthplace of civilization. The first civilization developed in the southern region of Mesopotamia called Sumer. Here, villages grew into cities and cities grew into city-states. By about 2800 BC, most Sumerians lived in a city-state. The city-state consisted of a central city, often protected by a defensive wall, and surrounding towns and villages that depended on the city for leadership, assistance, and protection. 6500 BC, Halaf period. 6000 BC, the pottery wheel is used to create fine vessels for food storage. 5500 BC, Ubaid period. 5000 BC, 4500 BC, the seed plow is used, allowing plowing and seeding to be done at the same time. 4000 BC, 3500 BC. To defend themselves against invaders, the civilizations of Mesopotamia developed tools of war and styles of warfare, such as the wheeled chariot, bronze and iron weapons, and protective army boots for soldiers. Center of attention. The permanent settlements of southern Mesopotamia became a center of agriculture and trade, both for its citizens and for nomadic peoples from neighboring regions. Groups of peoples invaded and conquered Mesopotamia, while others settled there peacefully and slowly gained power over time. The history of ancient Mesopotamia includes many different groups of people, conflicts, and cultural developments such as the inventions of the wheel and writing. What is civilization? Most historians agree that a civilization is a group of people that share common languages, some form of writing, advanced technology and science, and systems of government and religion. The name Mesopotamia comes from a Greek word that means between two rivers. 3000 BC. An early form of writing develops into cuneiform or wedge-shaped symbols. 2500 BC. Sumerian period. Large step temples with shrines on top called ziggurats are built. 2000 BC. Akkadian period. 1500 BC. Babylonian period. The Ishtar gates guard the ancient walled city of Babylon. 1000 BC. Persians invade. 539 BC. Assyrian period. 500 BC. Mountains to marshes. The boundaries of Mesopotamia were marked by the two great rivers of the region, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the coast of the Persian Gulf. To the north and the east lay the Zagros and the Taros mountain ranges. In the southwest, the Arabian desert bordered the rich floodplains of the west bank of the Euphrates River. The southernmost region of Mesopotamia was a flat plain with marshes near the head of the Persian Gulf. The north. In the mountainous north, winters were cold and wet. Rain and snow provided water for a variety of different plants to grow. On the mountainsides, forests of oak, pine, cedar, and juniper trees gave food and shelter for wild sheep, goats, wolves, bears, hyenas, and leopards. Mesopotamia. Zagros Mountains. Nineveh, Assyria, Euphrates River. Akkad, Tigris River. Babylon, Uruk, Sumer, Lagash, Persian Gulf. Arabian Desert, Mediterranean Sea, Syria, Taurus Mountains. The Tigris and Euphrates emptied into the Persian Gulf 5,000 years ago. Today the rivers meet to form a third river, the Shat al-Arab. The floodplain is much wider today than it was in ancient times. Floodplains of the South. Further south on the plain where the ancient rivers met the Persian Gulf, there was very little rain. Summer temperatures reached as high as 125 degrees Fahrenheit or 52 degrees Celsius. Plants, such as reeds and date palms, grew close to the rivers and streams. Further inland, the soil was dry and sandy. Many wild animals, including lions, leopards, wild cattle, boar, deer, gazelle, ostriches, vultures, and eagles, lived in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia. Foothills and grasslands. South of the mountains lay foothills and grassy plains. The grasslands experienced hot, dry summers that allowed for a long growing season. Less rain and snow fell in the plains than in the mountains, and hot winds blew in from the southern deserts in the summer. Farmers grew grain such as wheat and barley and grazed sheep, goats, pigs, and oxen on the grassy plains. The life-giving floods. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were fed by tributaries that carried silt and soil down from the mountains. In spring, melting snow and heavy rains added large volumes of water to the rivers. The fast-flowing rivers often overflowed their banks, flooding the plains of southern Mesopotamia. The annual floods left behind the minerals washed down from the mountains, making the soil rich and fertile. Farmers of Mesopotamia depended on the rich soil to grow barley, wheat, and other crops. In the northern Zagros, the mountains are snow-capped. The need for water. Farmers developed ways to water crops before they were drowned by spring floods. They used irrigation systems to carry water away from the rivers to ditches and canals where water was dammed and used to water fields during the growing season. Irrigation allowed for more crops to be grown and sold, adding to the wealth of the southern region. The Great Empires. Mesopotamia is the name given to the region where many different peoples made their homes, including the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians. Farming communities. In southern Mesopotamia, the earliest settlements were part of the Ubaid culture. They created small farming villages and towns and built the first temples in Mesopotamia. By 4500 BC, Ubaid culture had spread to the north, where the farming villages of the Halaf culture already existed. People in the northern villages raised animals, grew grains, hunted wild animals, and gathered plants for food. The Akkadians. The land of Akkad was north of Sumer. The Akkadians conquered Sumer in 2340 BC and united all of southern Mesopotamia under one rule. The capital city of the kingdom was Agade. By about 2125 BC, fighting between city-states led to the collapse of Akkad. Sumerians from the southern city of Ur defeated the Akkadians and ruled southern Mesopotamia again. The Sumerians. By 3800 BC, people known as Sumerians ruled southern Mesopotamia. Large settlements in Sumer grew into cities, which eventually became city-states. Some well-known Sumerian city-states were Ur, Lagash, and Uruk. Ur was originally an Ubaid village, but its location close to the Euphrates River made the city one of the most important trading centers by about 2500 BC. The rise of Babylon. By 2000 BC, the Amorites, nomads from the west, had begun moving into the cities of Sumer. In time, Amorites became kings of most cities in southern Mesopotamia, including Babylon. The Hittites, warriors from the north, conquered Babylon in 1595 BC. The Hittites left Babylon, and it fell under the rule of the Kesites, a group of nomadic people who had slowly settled throughout southern Mesopotamia. The city of Babylon was ruled by the Kesites until about 1170 BC. Sargon the Great led the Akkadian armies against Sumer. He was one of many great warriors from Mesopotamian cultures. The Assyrians. Assyria lay between Akkad and the Taurus Mountains. To the south were the more powerful city-states of Mesopotamia. Around 1100 BC, the Assyrians began to send military expeditions west to control important trade routes. By 824 BC, the Assyrians had conquered all of Mesopotamia and had built up a large army that used iron weapons and metal armor. To keep control of the lands they conquered, the Assyrian kings ordered the people to relocate to different areas to prevent them from revolting against Assyrian rule. Great palaces decorated with carved stone statues and reliefs showing military battles were built during the Assyrian Empire. In this carved stone relief, an Assyrian king named Esarhaddon leads the conquered by nose rings to new lands. The birth of kings. As Sumerian civilization grew, leaders became increasingly more important. Groups of men called councils of elders were the first to rule city-states. The council appointed temporary leaders in times of crisis. A leader called an ensi was appointed to deal with agricultural problems. A lugal was chosen to lead the city's army during times of war. As rivalries worsened among city-states, the power of these leaders grew. By 2800 BC, the lugals had become chief priests, lawmakers, and military commanders. The Babylonians. The kings of Assyria were not entirely successful in preventing revolts. By 614 BC, different groups of people, including the Chaldeans in the south and the Medes to the east, had united to fight against Assyrian rule. Together, these groups, who came to be called the Babylonians, established a new Babylonian empire led by King Nabopolassar. The city of Babylon was rebuilt, but the new empire was weakened by rulers who fought one another for power. A stone statue shows Gudea, an ancient Sumerian king. City-states. Each city-state was independent from the others with its own leaders, laws, and holidays. Different city-states ruled over the others at various times. Wars and agreements were made between city-states. The city of Babylon. Babylon began as a small village in the kingdoms of Sumer and Akkad. The name Babylon comes from the word Bab-Elam or Babel, meaning the gate of God. Under the Amorite kings, Babylon was a center of learning and scholarship. It became one of the greatest cities in ancient Mesopotamia. 1. People lived in houses made of mud bricks. 2. People entered the city through gates. In Babylon, there were 8 main gates that surrounded the city. 3. In Babylon, the main street was called Procession Street. 4. Many city-states were protected by walls to keep out invaders. 5. Kings and city-states built elaborate palaces and temples. In Babylon, the Hanging Gardens, a series of lush gardens, were ordered to be built by King Nebuchadnezzar II. 6. The largest temples also included a ziggurat, dedicated to the main god or goddess of the city. The main god of the ancient city of Babylon was called Marduk. Cities of Assyria. Nineveh, a city in the north, was the Assyrian capital. The walls that surrounded the city had 15 main gates, each guarded by stone bull statues. Early records say that Nineveh was a beautiful city with parks, a botanical garden, and a zoo. Daily life. The wealthiest people in Mesopotamia were government officials, professional soldiers, priests, owners of large parcels of land, and rich traders. Free citizens worked as merchants, farmers, and laborers. Free workers or clients were less wealthy and usually rented farmland from free citizens. There were also slaves in Mesopotamian society. Slaves built the ziggurat in Babylon. Slave labor. Most slaves were prisoners of war captured from outside Mesopotamia. Slavery was also a form of punishment for Mesopotamians who broke the law by assaulting family members. Free workers could volunteer themselves or their family members into slavery to repay debts. Once their services to their owners were complete, slaves could work at other jobs to earn money. They were allowed to own property and conduct business. Some slaves made enough money to purchase their freedom. Family life. A Mesopotamian family was made up of a married couple and their children. Relatives lived together or close to each other. Marriages were arranged by the fathers of the bride and groom. Most men had one wife, but they had the right to marry a second wife if the first was unable to have children. The series of panels on this carved stone relief show Mesopotamians doing their daily tasks. Women in Mesopotamia. From childhood, girls were taught to be wives, mothers, and housekeepers, but some also became priestesses, poets, or even tavern keepers. Women spun and wove cloth, ground grain, cooked and made beverages, especially beer. Upon her husband's death, a woman fell under the protection of her husband's father or brother or her grown son. Property was usually passed from father to son, but women could inherit land and household furnishings. Hijab. Women often wore veils and loose clothing in Assyria. The veil distinguished respectable married women from slaves and unrespectable women who were not allowed to wear the veil and could be punished by law for doing so. Today, many women in Iraq continue to wear the veils in public in a custom called hijab. 2 veiled shoppers in Baghdad, the capital city of modern Iraq. Food. Bread and porridge made from locally grown grains were the main foods in Mesopotamia. Barley grew well in the south and was the most common grain. Other crops included cucumbers, onions, chickpeas, lentils, beans, and lettuce. One of the most important foods in southern Mesopotamia were dates. Dates could be eaten fresh, dried and preserved, or pressed into a syrup that was used to sweeten food and drinks. In the north, where it was too cold for date palms to grow, honey was used as sweetener. Animals were raised and hunted for food. Goats and cows provided milk. People caught fish in rivers, streams, and swamps. Meat was sometimes boiled, but more commonly roasted or grilled. Most cooking was done in a closed dome oven or in hot ashes. Figs were a staple of the Mesopotamian diet, along with cucumbers, onions, lettuce, and chickpeas. Barley was used to make beer. Everyone, including children, drank a weak form of beer, which was flavored with dates, honey, and spices. Making cloth. Sheep's wool was an important material for making cloth. Sheep were the most common domesticated animal in Mesopotamia. Flax, a blue flowered plant, was also grown to make cloth. Once harvested, the flax was cleaned and combed and then woven into a material known as linen. Linen was used to make clothes of better quality. Assyrian men dyed and curled their beards. A Babylonian priest and a king and finally made clothes. Clothing through the ages. The early farmers of Mesopotamia wore clothes made of sheep or goat skins. Sumerian men often wore sheepskin skirts and short capes over their shoulders. Sumerian women wound strips of woven cloth around their bodies and draped the loose end over their shoulder. Babylonian clothing for men and women consisted of full-length, short-sleeved tunics and fringed shawls made from brightly dyed and embroidered wool. The Assyrians wore clothing similar to the Babylonians but added jewelry, such as heavy gold earrings, bracelets, and necklaces. Most Mesopotamians wore leather-soled sandals with heel guards to protect their feet. Until the time of the Assyrians, even soldiers wore sandals into battle. The Assyrians introduced knee-high leather boots with soles that offered protection on rough terrain. Homes. Free citizens lived in simple, one-story homes made from sun-dried mud and straw bricks. A room with a drainage hole in the floor served as a bathroom. Each home also had a kitchen with a fireplace and cooking utensils, a shrine for worship, and a reception room where guests could stay overnight. Homes in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia were made from bundles of reeds tied together, much like some are today. 1. Ladders led to the roof, where people slept on hot summer nights. 2. Staircases overlooked the courtyards. 3. Several rooms surrounded an open courtyard. This open-air courtyard let light into rooms. 4. In wealthy homes, slaves prepared meals. 5. When entering the courtyard, people washed the dirt from their feet. 6. In wealthy homes, bedrooms were on the second floor. 7. Beds were low cots on wooden legs or simply mats on the floor. Economy. Mesopotamia's economy was based on agriculture. Crop surpluses meant that people could trade food for other goods. Some people survived by trading their crafts, skills, or labor for food. Merchants and scribes emerged to keep track of transactions. Before long, trade spread among city-states. Agriculture. In the south, irrigation allowed farmers to bring water to their crops before the annual floodwaters came. The invention of the seed plow meant that farmers could break up the soil and plant the seeds all in one pass. The seed plow and irrigation allowed for more crops to be grown. The crops were traded as raw materials or used to make products such as oil. The most important crops were grains, such as barley and wheat. Sesame, which was eaten or used to make oil, and flax, which could be eaten, made into oil, or used for making ropes and cloth, were also grown. Dates, leeks, onions, and lentils were harvested for food. Modern-day farmers harvesting wheat along the Tigris River, which marks the eastern edge of the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent was an area suitable for growing crops in the otherwise dry lands of the Middle East. Raising animals. In northern Mesopotamia, people raised livestock such as sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle on the open meadows. Livestock provided food and materials for making leather and wool. Animals also provided a source of power to do work, allowing fewer workers to complete more work in a shorter time. Oxen were used to pull plows and wagons. Donkeys carried heavy loads on their backs and pulled carts. Money matters. Mesopotamians originally traded through barter. Barter is a system in which one product or service is traded for another product or service of similar value. In time, bars of valuable metals such as copper, silver, and gold were exchanged for other goods. Merchants measured these metals out in each transaction. As trade increased, it became more important to record all these transactions. Their records were written in a system called cuneiform. The Hittites, who conquered Babylon in 1595 BC, were great traders. Through trade, the laws and ideas of Mesopotamia were spread to other lands. Trade. The need for materials drove city-states to trade with neighboring states. When building materials such as timber and stones were needed, they had to be brought in from the mountain areas. Metal ores and precious stones were also brought from the mountains to make tools, jewelry, and weapons. Traders led caravans between Mesopotamia and the Zagros and Taurus mountains, and even as far as Egypt to the west. Some merchants used donkey carts to carry their goods. Others used the Euphrates and Tigris rivers to ship their wares downstream. Caravans including animals loaded with goods crossed deserts in search of trading partners. Languages. Writing first began as a system of record-keeping for administrators and traders. In about 3500 BC, pictographs, or shapes that represent whole words or groups of words, were etched onto clay tags and attached to bags of grain so farmers could keep track of how much grain they had. Over time, the use of pictographs changed into a written language. This writing system is called cuneiform. Cuneiform is one of the oldest known writing systems. Writing. Cuneiform was a form of writing in which words or ideas were represented by characters made up of triangles and straight lines. The characters were pressed into wet clay tablets using a reed stylus. The characters represented groups of sounds, syllables, or entire words that often meant different things depending on how they were used. Cuneiform was invented by the Sumerians, but it was adopted by the Akkadians, Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Writing on the wall. Cuneiform changed when scribes realized that characters could represent sounds as well as objects. Scribes started using characters that represented small words as syllables or parts of larger words. By stringing together 3 short words, the scribes could create the sound of a long word. The association between characters and sounds meant that far fewer characters were required because there were far fewer sounds than there were objects. The rebus, a type of modern-day puzzle, also uses the sounds of words to represent syllables. Try reading the rebus below to see what it would have been like to read in ancient Mesopotamia. I believe you are a great person. I believe you are a great person. The talk of the town. Mesopotamia was home to many different groups of people, each with their own spoken language. The language spoken by the Sumerians is not spoken today. The Akkadians were the first Mesopotamians to speak a Semitic language, or a language belonging to a group of related languages that also includes Hebrew and Arabic. The Akkadian language changed over time. Forms of the language were used by Assyrians and the Babylonians. Each of these groups adapted cuneiform script slightly to its own languages. Poetry. Poetry was an important form of spoken and written literature. The first Mesopotamian poet known by name was Enheduanna. She was a priestess and the daughter of a king. In one of Enheduanna's poems, the goddess Inanna is a ferocious warrior. In another, the poet writes about Inanna's role in ruling over civilization as well as home and children. The Library of Nineveh. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal ordered his scribes to copy and collect cuneiform clay tablets from across the region to keep in the capital, Nineveh. This formed the first library of Mesopotamia, containing over 22,000 works, including some copies of earlier Sumerian and Akkadian texts. Ashurbanipal's collection included works on science, medicine, astronomy, religion, and folk tales. Modern researchers studying Mesopotamia use the vast library of Nineveh as their primary source for many ancient texts. Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the myth of Sumerian king Gilgamesh of Uruk. The stories in the epic teach lessons about the meaning of friendship, fears of sickness and death, and the search for everlasting life. Over time, these stories were collected into one long poem that was passed from one Mesopotamian civilization to another. Later, civilizations added more tales and wrote new versions of others. In the story, Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu cut off the head of the demon Humbaba, right, guardian of the cedar forest of Lebanon. This example of Sumerian cuneiform script is a record of a farmer's number of goats and sheep. Scribes. Schools in Mesopotamia were called Idubas, meaning tablet house. Only boys were allowed to attend. The schools developed as priests began training young boys as scribes to read and write cuneiform. Students attended from sunrise to sunset, beginning in early youth and continuing into their young adulthood. They only had about 6 days off from school every month, 3 holy days and 3 free days. Young scribes who spoke without permission or were late for school were punished with lashes from a stick or cane. All in a day's work. The first thing a young boy learned in school was how to make a clay tablet and how to hold a reed stylus properly. He memorized long lists of cuneiform symbols and the meanings of each symbol. Young scribes also learned the history of Mesopotamia, both from clay tablets that retold the events of the king's reigns and from poetry. Scribes studied math and astrology so they could make calendars, and they learned law codes. Scribes learned to diagnose illnesses and to create medicine. To prepare them for life in the priesthood, young boys were taught divining, the art of reading the will of the gods and of predicting the future. A scribe learning to write copied cuneiform on a wet clay tablet. If he made a mistake, the clay was smoothed over and the scribe tried again. The record keepers. Once they were fully trained, scribes had an essential role in society as the recorders of facts, figures, ideas, and traditions. Many scribes worked as secretaries, bookkeepers, accountants, archivists, recorders, and writers of hymns and epics. Some scribes sat at city gates and hired out their writing services to illiterate clients. In some parts of modern-day Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries, this service still exists. Other scribes in ancient Mesopotamia became doctors and diviners. A scribe during Sumerian times was an important man because of his ability to write. Scribes were hired by people who could not read and write to write letters and record business transactions. The letter of the law. The Mesopotamian legal system was based on a collection of laws. The laws of Ur-Nammu dates back to around 2100 BC. It consisted of 57 laws concerning crime, family, inheritance, labor, slaves, and taxes. The best-known Mesopotamian collection of laws was the Code of Hammurabi. The law code was written by King Hammurabi, an Amorite king who ruled Babylon from 1792 BC to 1750 BC. The code was very strict, stating the rule of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The 282 laws of Hammurabi's code dealt with family, labor, trade, and property. The laws were carved into 8-foot or 3-meter tall stones that were placed around the kingdom for all to see. Hammurabi receives the code of laws from Shamash, the god of justice.